Good day, everyone. Today, our discussion would mainly focus on the introduction to Ifugao Indigenous Knowledge systems and practices. And the first question that we would be addressing was that what is Indigenous knowledge, or what are these Ifugao Indigenous knowledge? What are these indigenous systems, and what are these indigenous practices? Now, let us note that there are different authors who would uh, give or who would coin definitions on what is indigenous knowledge, or what are these systems, or what are these practices. But for us, we'd be using the definition of Baptist in 2005, as well as the definition of the United Nations on what is IKSP, or when we talk about IKSP, this is the indigenous knowledge systems and practices. So IKSP, according to Baptist, is a complex knowledge systems that have been developed over time by a particular area and that have been transmitted from generation to generation. So that is IKSP. Now let us note all the different important words and phrases on this definition. So first, unang-una, syempre makikita natin dyan yung developed over time by a particular area. Okay, so IKSP doesn't or IKSP is not developed in a day or in a month, in a year. It's been developed over time, coming from generations to generations. These are transmitted from generations to generations. So indigenous or traditional knowledge is transmitted between generations to generations in different types. It could be oral, through stories, songs, dances. We also have here carvings, paintings, and performances. This is coming from the definition of the United Nations on what is indigenous knowledge. Okay, so over the years, here in Ifugao, the Ifugaos have grappled with adversity. So napakaraming kinaharap, no, na problema because of the environment, because of the harsh environment. Let us take note that Ifugao, for example, is located in the Cordilleran region, in a mountainous region. And so life here is very much tough, especially that the first survival skill that should be adopted by the Ifugaos is how would they turn this rugged terrains or the rugged mountains into something livable, or into something that they could live off. And that is the reason why we have the Ifugao rice terraces, or commonly known or formally known as the rice terraces of the Cordilleras. This was inscribed by the UNESCO as a World Heritage Site in 1995. However, due to some problems of modernization and globalization, this World Heritage Site is actually at risk of being destroyed. And these IRTs, or the rice terraces of the Cordilleras, are a living example of harmony between humankind and then the natural environment. And that is because of indigenous knowledge. That is because of indigenous practices and the practice of indigenous systems that are being practiced by our forefathers here in the Cordilleras, or here in Ifugao. So IKSPs, or the indigenous knowledge, the systems and the practices, assured sustainable development through direct connection of resources on resource management and conservation. And that is very much evident on the Ifugao rice terraces, or we would just call it IRT. Okay? However, there are many challenges in IKSPs. Napakarami pong kinakaharap na problema on how do we sustain indigenous knowledge systems and practices. So on your pic, on the screen, makikita nyo dyan, that is actually Banawe. So, gone are the days, no, na ang makikita natin dyan is the lush fields, where the lush fields, no, But this time, ang makikita natin dyan, it's obviously seen in their house terraces instead of rice terraces. So that is one factor affecting IKSP. So because of rapid population growth, imbes na makultivate itong mga fields na to, itong rice paddies, instead of continuous cultivation, ginagawa ng residential areas. Why? Wala nang paglalagyan ng bahay. And so, these rice paddies are converted into residential areas or business centers, no? The international market is also one problem, also one challenge in IKSP. Bakit nagiging challenge ang international market? 'di ba, dapat magpasalamat tayo because internationalization would create tourism industries, no? But the thing was, the effect of internationalization, especially on the markets, was that napapalitan, nagkakaroon ng homogenization. Okay? Mamaya pag-uusapan natin yung term na cultural homogenization. Okay? So international market, ang system na kasi ngayon, we are living by the shadow of the notion that these rice terraces, for example, are just for tourist attractions, no? Nawawala na yung essence of these rice terraces within us on how important these terraces are in our culture, and not just in our culture and our traditions, but how important these terraces are, or this indigenous knowledge in sustaining the resources that we have now. Okay? So pangatlo, aside from rapid population growth, international market, meron tayong educational system. The problem of the educational system was that we adopted too much of Western education, or our education is westernized. The system of education in the Philippines is westernized, no? It's just that very late in 2013 that we have the revised Basic Education Curriculum Act, no, na naglalagay ng mother tongue based multilingual education in grade levels 1, 2, and 3. But what is the essence of having that mother tongue based education when in fact it stopped at that third level, or at the grade 3 level of basic elementary education? Now, what about in high school? What about in tertiary? 'Di ba? It was so late, no? Ngayon lang natin na i-incorporate ang IKSP as one of the elective subject for Ifugao State University in most of our curricular programs, no? But the thing was, how far or how deep would we inculcate, or how deep would we base our indigenous education to this one? Gaano? Saan tayo makakarating? How far would we deal with this IKSP education? 'Di ba? Because later on when we go out, there's no such thing as IKSP program, 'di ba? Pag wala ka sa gobyerno, wala ka sa cultural agencies of the Philippines, hindi mo ma-practice, 'di ba? Ang mapapag-aralan mo sa IKSP, more or less, 'di ba? So these are the problems, no? Environmental degradation. Okay, because of international market, rapid population growth, educational system na mas gusto nating humawak ng papel at ballpen. We want to work on offices. We don't want to work on fields because parang ang tingin natin sa sa rice terraces, or pag pumupunta ka sa rice terraces, like, ew, 'di ba? Parang yak yung ganun ang educational system na na-inculcate sa atin, 'di ba? Hindi naman natin masasabi ng educational system ay pumunta tayo nag-tour doon sa rice terraces, tapos okay na yon, promoting rice terraces, without actually doing or without actually practicing what should be practiced in rice terraces. And so with that, nagkakaroon ng environmental degradation, 'di ba? So conversion of agricultural lands to residential areas, nasisira na. So through modernization also, those winding roads, we thank the government for that, no, because of the road expansion. So nagkakaroon ng modernization sa ating mga lugar. but sometimes it's to the expense of destroying the natural environment, no? We are destroying the natural habitat of whatever is indigenous in that area, di ba? So parang in the end, we would just see rice terraces or the rituals on poster cards only, nothing more, nothing less, di ba? Because of too much uh, environmental degradation, no? Development processes, yon, globalization, pressures related to rapid modernization, and of course, this one, cultural homogenization. Napakalaking problema po ng cultural homogenization sa atin. Bakit problem ang cultural homogenization? Unang-una, okay, so yung cultural homogenization na sinasabi natin. So for example, the national government is pushing a unified culture, no? Like for example, the unified language, 'di ba? Yung promotion of one national culture at the expense of yung nalilimutan na natin yung sarili nating kultura, in which we as part of the indigenous cultural communities have our own distinct culture. However, the government is pushing into a national culture in which ito nang nagiging symbol of being Filipino, for example, or the language, no? So at the expense of minor cultures, no? So yun ang nagiging problema. Now, why youngsters don't appreciate IKSP? Bakit hindi na-appreciate ng mga kabataan ang IKSP? Unang-una, they would say it's primitive. Parang pang sinauna yan. Kumbaga, pang museum na lang itong mga IKSP na to. Hindi na daw ito on trend, 'di ba? It's very simple. In the case of Filipinos, no, ayaw natin nung simple, gusto natin ng magarbo or what, and we would often sometimes say that IKSP is static. Okay? Hindi siya nababago. Now, please remember, no, that IKSP or Indigenous Knowledge systems and practices coming from this term system are experiences of our ancestors from generations to generations. So it is not static. Hindi siya stagnant. Okay? Others would say it's not knowledge. IKSP is not knowledge but pure folklore. 'Di ba? Mga kwentong bayan lang ang mga to. These are just stories to tell, nothing more, nothing less. These are just poster cards. These are just to be used for tourism purposes. 'Di ba? But the real essence of IKSP is the practice, is the appreciation. Okay? So yun po. These are the problems na kinakaharap natin on why youngsters don't really appreciate IKSP. Now, the next question is, who are the indigenous? Or what is it to be indigenous? According to the Webster's New 20th Century Dictionary, indigenous could be described as native-born, growing or produced locally in a country or a region, not exotic as corn and cotton are indigenous to North America. Okay? So, in short, it is innate, it is inherent, it is inborn. Being indigenous is innate, it is inherent, and it is inborn. That is according to the Webster's Dictionary. And so we would simultaneously say that being indigenous is being original, being native, or being aboriginal. Okay, so some arguments would say, if I am not, or if my parents were not Cordillerans, or if my parents were not Ifugaos, but I am born here in Ifugao, am I considered indigenous? Diba? Yun yung mga tanong. Am I part of that indigenous people? Am I part of the ICC? Since dito naman ako lumaki, dito ako nagkamalay, dito ako pinanganak, kahit Ilocano mga parents ko, yung mga ganon na mga tanong. 'Di ba? So who are the indigenous? Later on, as we go on with the discussions, we would really know who are indigenous legally and psychologically. Because legally, we cannot just say na, oh, indigenous, you belong into the indigenous cultural community or you are indigenous people. However, psychologically, we could say within ourselves na, ako, Igorot ako or Ifugao ako, Tag-Ifugao ako, I'm an indigenous people coming from this area kasi dito ako pinanganak. Diba? So, those are the terms that we should consider. According to the United Nations, indigenous populations display the following characteristics. Unang-una, descendants of groups who were in the territory at the time when other groups of different cultures or ethnic origin arrived. So based on this definition, we are indigenous. Okay? Because we are already here, or our forefathers, our ancestors were already here before the arrival of the Americans, before the arrival of the Spaniards, diba? So we are indigenous. Our population is part of the indigenous population, diba? So the second one, possessed, preserved intact customs and traditions of their ancestors, which are similar to those characterized as indigenous. So we have the practice. We are practicing those knowledge given to us or passed to us by our ancestors, di ba? Passed from generations to generations. And formally, indigenous populations are placed under a state structure which incorporates national, social, and cultural characteristics alien to their own. And in the Philippines, formally, we are recognized as indigenous people here in the Cordilleras through the NCIP, through Republic Act 8371 or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Okay. Lastly, indigenous population is accepted by the group or the community as one of its members was to be regarded as an indigenous person. So if you are accepted, for example, in Ifugao as part of the community, then you could be considered as an indigenous person. Okay? Now we also have here definitions from the World Bank, no, on what are indigenous people. It could be described as with close attachment to ancestral territories and to the natural resources in the area. So for Ifugao, check. Select self-identification and identification by others as members of a distinct cultural group. Yes, check din yan sa atin. Indigenous language often different from the national language. We all have our own dialect, no? We spoke our own dialect. We speak our own dialect. Okay? And primarily subsistence-oriented production. Pag sinasabi nating subsistence-oriented, hindi siya industry-oriented. Kumbaga, agricultural production ang kinabubuhay natin. Okay, here in Ifugao, which is true. And one evidence of that, of course, is the indigenous Ifugao rice terraces or the IRTs. Chapter 2, Section 3 of the Republic Act 8371 or the IPRA law also defined indigenous cultural communities and indigenous peoples. Now, this refers to a group of people or homogeneous societies identified by self-ascription and ascription by others. So, nagtutugma siya sa World Bank and the United Nations. Association by yourself and acceptance by the group, okay, who have continuously lived as organized community on communally bounded and defined territory on a certain geographic location. So, magkatugma din yan sa definition ng United Nations and then the World Bank. And who have, under claims of ownership since time immemorial, occupied, possessed, and utilized such territories sharing common bands of language, customs, traditions, and other distinctive cultural traits or who have true resistance to political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, non-indigenous religions and cultures became historically differentiated from the majority of the Filipinos. Okay? So we are practicing our own culture, which is very much different from the cultures of those who are already accustomed with the Hispanic traditions, no? Yung mga mga Ilocano, mga people from the Tagalog region, no? So our culture, our practice culture is very much different from them. Okay? ICCs or IPs shall likewise include peoples who are regarded as indigenous on account of their descent from the populations which inhabited the country. Okay, so we have indigenous people, also mga lumad, diba? At the time of conquest or colonization, or at the time of inroads of non-indigenous religions and cultures, or the establishment of present state boundaries, who retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, but who may have been displaced from their traditional domains, or who may have resettled outside their ancestral domains. So kung titingnan natin, kung if we would really understand the definitions of ICCs and IPs under Republic Act number 8371, Chapter 2, Section 3, as well as the definitions of the United Nations, the World Bank, and then the Webster's Dictionary, it seems that all of us are indigenous. Okay? All Filipinos are indigenous. Because on account of our descent, indigenous people naman ang ating mga pinagmulan. The thing was that when we associate in being indigenous, that is being barbaric, no? So yun naman naging problema natin. Yun yung naging difference ng being indigenous and being a Filipino. Pag sinasabi nating Filipino or Pilipino, okay, medyo ano yan. They are the product of modernization. However, pag sinasabi nating indigenous, parang sinasabi natin na mga locals, 'di ba? Or they are native people, mga those coming from the mountains, 'di ba? Mga Cordillerans, mga Ifugao, mga Igorot, mga Aitas, mga Lumas, our other indigenous peoples group, no? Mga IPGs. So, yun yung nagiging problema. Nagkakaroon ng homogenization. Ito yung effect ng homogenization na tinatawag. We call those nakabarong, nakasaya as Filipino. And then pag nakabahag or tapis or in any garments used by the indigenous people, sasabihin natin, natives, di ba? Indigenous people. Diba? So, yun. What is indigenous knowledge now? Indigenous knowledge refers to the unique, traditional, local knowledge existing within and developed around the specific conditions of women and men indigenous to a particular geographic area. So, indigenous people present in a particular geographic area, practicing now indigenous knowledge in a geographic area. This is according to Grenier in 1998. Okay? The development of indigenous knowledge systems covers all aspects of life, including management of natural resources. Okay? So, the Ifugao rice terraces is actually one of the best example of this indigenous knowledge system on natural environment conservation here in Ifugao. By the way, when we talk about the IRTs, the Ifugao rice terraces, we are not just talking about the rice paddies, but we are talking about the system. No, IRT is a system. It's not just about the rice paddies. IRT is comprised also of where water sources would come from, the muyung system surrounding these rice paddies, and then the agricultural system that is practiced. Okay, so that is Ifugao rice terraces. Okay, crucial to the survival of the people who generated this system. So, saan nagmula ang pinakain ng mga ancestors natin sa ating mga sa ating mga ancestors also? The rice terraces, diba? How do they manage the resources in these terraces? It's within the cluster. Okay? So, these knowledge systems are cumulative. Okay? Cumulative siya. It's from generations to generations, representing generations of experiences. So, it's not static as we have been thinking of. Parang inisip natin, hindi nagbabago, dapat ganyan yan. No. Indigenous knowledge is not static. It's a cumulative representation of generations of experience, careful observations, diba? And trial and error experiments of our ancestors. That is indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is knowledge that a local community accumulates over generations of living in a particular environment, and it encompasses all forms of knowledge, the technologies that were developed, the know-how skills, the practices, the traditions, and beliefs that enable a community to achieve stable livelihoods in their environment. This was coined by the United Nations Environment Program, or the UNEP. Other terms for indigenous knowledge would be classified as traditional knowledge, indigenous technical knowledge, or indigenous knowledge systems. All of these are indigenous knowledge or IKs. Okay? IK is unique in every culture and society. Iba-iba po. Depende po sa ancestors natin, our descent, yung pinagmulan natin. It represents all the skills and innovations of a people and embodies the collective wisdom and resourcefulness of a community. So the system, the Ifugao rice terraces system that we are having right now is a collective wisdom of all those who have generated the system long ago. Okay, hindi lang po galing sa isang tao ang indigenous knowledge. This is an accumulated practice. Okay? So how did the Ifugaos practice indigenous knowledge? Unang-una, we have here agriculture, soil, and water management. Diba? How do they manage agriculture? How do they manage soil? And how do they manage water in as the resources? No, these were resources in Ifugao. We have here the creation of the rice paddies, diba? So later on, as we go on with our lessons, iisa-isahin natin to. Agriculture, soil and water management, natural resources management, no? We also have here customary laws like ugub. Paano nga ba nila nasa-settle ang mga disputes? Of course, by using customary laws. We have your belief system and the performing arts. Ano yung kanilang paniniwala? The performing arts that we have, the dances, the chants, the hudhud and the alim, for example, our intangible heritage, kumbaga. Okay? So, another term again, tangible and intangible heritage. Ito lahat pag-aaralan natin dito sa IKSP. Cultural values, di ba? What are the cultural values that are being shared by the Ifugaos? The mere fact, the mere sharing of the taluan, no? Or yung nganga, yung moma, that is a cultural value. It starts conversation among Ifugaos, no? Now, what is the contribution of Ifugao to the world? There are many contributions, but the indigenous knowledge systems and practices that are being practiced by the Ifugaos now and uh, many years ago is their contribution to the world. And coming from those IKSPs, we have now the Ifugao rice terraces as one of the famous landmark of Ifugao knowledge, as well as the Ifugao native house. No, the Ifugao rice terraces as being part of the World Heritage Site, and then the Ifugao native house as one of the both no being engineering marvels. For example, the American Association of Engineers would really marvel on how these people, how these uneducated people on architecture and engineering would come up with such a house, no? Without even using nails, di ba? Paano sila nakagawa? Hindi naman sila graduate ng architecture, hindi naman sila nag-aral ng engineering. These are engineering marvels that are left by Ifugao ingenuity. And this is a symbol of indigenous knowledge of Ifugaos to the world. Okay? So, like waters that give meaning to rivers, the Ifugao indigenous knowledge gives life to both tangible and intangible heritage or cultures of the Ifugaos as the inseparable body and soul of the Ifugaos as their contribution to the society. Now, why are we learning these ones? Okay, we have here the legal basis of integrating indigenous knowledge in the education curriculum. The first one is RA 8371, or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, also known or commonly known as the IPRA law. This is an act that recognizes, protects, and promotes the rights of indigenous cultural communities and indigenous peoples, or the ICCs and the IPs. Through this RA 8371, it creates a National Commission of Indigenous People, that is the NCIP, establishing, implementing mechanisms, and appropriating funds thereof. So we have our legal framework on indigenous knowledge in the education curriculum. We start it with the IPRA law. Okay, for the basic education, we have here DepEd Order number 62, series of 2011, adopting the National Indigenous Peoples Education, or the IPED policy framework. Okay, then in 2013, we have the Republic Act number 10533, or the Enhanced Basic Education Act, urging the adoption of an indigenous people's education framework. And through this, we have here DepEd Order number 43, series of 2013, which acts as the implementing rules and regulations of the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013. Through also the RA 10533, this resulted to the inclusion of the IKSPs and Indigenous Learning Systems, or the ILS, in the basic education curriculum. So nagkaroon tayo ng Mother Tongue-based multilingual education, or the MTB-BME, used for grade levels 1, 2, and 3. Ito po yung reason, or this is the legal reason why we are using Mother Tongue in teaching grade levels 1, 2, and 3. But it should not stop there. Okay, but it should not stop there. IKSP should also be included in higher grade levels. So for example, in senior high school, we have, or in teaching of arts, in teaching of music, we should always incorporate indigenous knowledge or indigenous systems. In the secondary, we have the CPAR, the Contemporary Philippine Arts from the regions, no? And that is one of the subject in which we could incorporate, no? We could incorporate IKSP as part of the course or as part of the subject. Okay? For the higher educational institutions, just such as the Ifugao State University, We are governed by CHED Memorandum Order number 2 series of 2019, enjoining all public and private higher educational institutions or HEIs to offer IP studies or Indigenous people studies or education in their respective curricula. Okay? For the case of Ifugao State University, the inclusion of IKSP as an elective subject in which ito pinag-aaralan natin ngayon is almost in almost all its curricular programs were approved by the university's Board of Regents. This decision is an offshoot of the Nurturing Indigenous Knowledge Expert or the Nike project from 2007 and then 2012 or 2012 rather. Okay, so Ifugao State University is actually one of the pioneer HEIs in the country to include IKSP as an elective subject. As an offshoot, also we have the IKSP workbook being published by the university as part of the resources in teaching IKSP here in the university. Okay, so that is the introduction to Ifugao Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices. And before I forget, IFSU also is the home of the GIA's office or the globally important agricultural heritage site office in the Philippines. Okay, because as of today, the only GIA's site or the only site part of the GIAS is the Ifugao or the rice terraces of the Cordilleras, specifically the IRT. And with that, we conclude our introduction to Ifugao Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices. As we go on forward, isa-isahin natin what are these knowledge, what are the systems, what are these practices for us also to learn and for us to share to other people what we have here in the Cordilleras or what we have here in Ifugao. So that would be all. Thank you very much.